Good morning and welcome to Madison Square Park Conservancy's annual symposium on public art. We are honored and thrilled that so many artists, colleagues, neighbors, supporters, and friends, those whose camaraderie we feel even on Zoom, have joined us for this virtual convening. My name is Brooke Kamen-Rappaport. I'm the Deputy Director and Martin Friedman, Chief Curator. Keats Meyer, our Executive Director, also welcomes you. Greening public art is made possible by generous support from the Henry Luce Foundation. Thank you, Mariko Silver and Terry Carbone. Leadership support for Maya Lin's Ghost Forest and accompanying public programs is generously provided by the Ruth Stanton Foundation. Thank you to our colleagues, Truth Mary Cole, Dana Klein, Hannah Stirs, Molly Melzinski, and Jaden Sanchez for their efforts this morning. And thank you to Sarah Stein-Sapir, Chair of our Art Council. As part of our work on Ghost Forest, now on view in the park, and Public Art Consortium meetings, the Lenape Center in New York guided Madison Square Park Conservancy on a land acknowledgement. Please let me share this with you at the commencement of today's program. Madison Square Park is located on Lenapehoking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenape Delaware people. We recognize that this land was forcibly taken, resulting in the displacement and genocide of the Lenape Delaware nations. Madison Square Park Conservancy respectfully acknowledges the Lenape Delaware peoples, past, present, and future, who continue to live, work, and connect to the land. The Conservancy honors the Lenape Delaware people, the original stewards of this land, through our commitment to a series of sustainability and restoration initiatives. In the coming years, we aim to reduce our carbon imprint, promote sustainable land management, and reintroduce species of fauna and flora indigenous to Lenapehoking to the park. It's now my pleasure to introduce Sheila Davidson, Chair of Madison Square Park Conservancy's Board of Trustees.
Thank you, Brooke. Good morning. For the last 6 years, Madison Square Conservancy has held our annual symposium on public art in person, most recently with hundreds of attendees in the School of Visual Arts Auditorium. During these annual gatherings, we've reckoned with issues of presenting and commissioning public art, of accessibility by neighbors and communities, of the dynamism and directness that the artists bring to the public realm, and of the role of historic monuments and how citizens and artists challenge long-held tenets of their placement and positioning. This year, the Conservancy welcomes all of you to Greening Public Art on Zoom. National and international artists, cultural innovators, and environmental leaders are with us today to discuss the impact of climate change and the Earth's great strength on their work. On behalf of my colleagues on the Conservancy's board, the staff who so expertly tends our 7-acre site, the wonderful artists whose work we have commissioned, and our neighbors, I thank you for attending. It's now my pleasure to welcome Ron Pizzuti, my fellow board member and chair of our art committee. Ron?
Okay. I would like to introduce Jonathan Kuhn, Director of Art and Antiquities, New York City Parks, and then we'll come back to Ron.
Hi, you can see me, I hope. Good morning. New York City I represent the city of New York, and we're so fortunate to have a partner as vibrant as the Madison Square Conservancy, which has been placing art literally and figuratively at the center of its activities for the last 20 years. We have a tradition at parks that's vital now for 50 more odd years called Art in the Parks, dating to 1967, with a group exhibition called Sculpture in Environment. Since then, we've featured more than 2,000 artists in more than 200 parks. And today's symposium considers environmental sculpture and how artists can actively participate in confronting and combating the global crisis that we face. There's an overlooked bronze bust in Central Park of a man named Alexander von Humboldt, dating to 1869, who around 1800 first called attention to human-induced climate change and its negative impacts. Seems like for the past 200 years, we've been catching up to his prescient warning. In recent years, we've had dozens of artists dealing with environmental issues in our parks, from material reclamation to sustainability to ecological understanding and awareness. Today, I'd like to also call out and celebrate Maya Lin's majestic and haunting ghost forest, which is on view currently in Madison Square Park. After these proceedings this morning, I ask you to get off the Zoom and visit the park and see that work and consider the issues that she's raised by this installation. I'd like to thank Sheila, Ron, the board of Madison Square Conservancy, and Executive Director Keats Myers for making Madison Square such a vital place. And now I'd like to turn over the floor back to Brooke, my colleague in government and partner, the Martin Friedman Curator of Art for Madison Square Conservancy. Thank you all for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you, Sheila. I will bring greetings from Ron Pizzuti, who is the chair of our art committee and a wonderful neighbor of Madison Square Park Conservancy. Hello again, everyone in Zoom land. Today's symposium, Greening Public Art, gathers extraordinary artists, thinkers, journalists, and environmental leaders who advance their work to focus on the power of the earth and land, the devastation of climate change, and the potential in nature-based solutions. Artists are confronting perils related to the environment and environmental justice, anticipation of another looming pandemic due to climate vulnerability, and concurrent issues of global migration, political turmoil, and food distribution. What are the implications on materials, siting, activism, responsibility, and the future that prevail for those who are involved with the greening of public art, agriculture, and conservation? Is this a new movement emerging from dire predictions for the welfare of citizens and the planet? And does public art's position in reaching large audiences become a key incentive to addressing these subjects? Our program will examine these vital questions and explore through works of art and nature-based solutions the range of responses to inextricable global crises. And today we will listen in the hope of raising awareness. Dear Climate with Una Shodhuri and Marina Zerkow guides a human awareness to climate change. Anita Fields uses materials directly from the earth to make art that unlocks complex and distorted Indigenous histories. Nicholas Galanin's work critiques and sanctifies the commodification of American Indian culture and the relationship to the land. Allison Janae Hamilton brings folklore and family narrative into her work and examines personal history with the land. Maya Lin demonstrates the intense power within an artist who uses materials directly from nature that defines and offers solutions to one of the cataclysmic crises of our time. Tavares Strachan's deep study of Black and Brown explorers has inspired his own investigations of science and the planet. The artists are joined by Sarah Douglas, editor-in-chief of Art News, who will moderate the opening panel discussion, also including Lucia Pietrowisti, the Serpentine Gallery's curator of ecology. Our keynote conversation with Maya Lin is moderated by Andrew Revkin of Columbia University's Earth Institute and a distinguished environmental journalist, and features Bill Ohlfelder, Executive Director of the Nature Conservancy in New York, Maria Rodale of the Rodale Institute, and Edwina von Gaal of Perfect Earth Project. It's my great honor to start off the morning with the opening panel discussion and welcome moderator Sarah Douglas and speakers Anita Fields, Allison Janae Hamilton, and Lucia Pietrowisti.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Douglas. I'm the editor of Art News magazine, and I will be the moderator on this panel. And I couldn't be more happy to do so because there are some fascinating artists here and an amazing curator and we have lots to talk about. So I'm going to get right to it. Before introducing all of them, I want to just say that since working on this and thinking about Maya Lin's project, I've been trying to formulate for myself the way in which artists bring our attention to aspects of climate change. And I was thinking about the idea that there are all these books and articles on this subject, and there are articles with overwhelming amounts of data, and there are books and articles that will like scare your pants off. And there's this saying in sort of the various awareness campaigns that you should meet people where they are, right? So to talk about important issues. And I was thinking that what artists do is not so much meeting people where they are, but they coax people through aesthetic means to a place where they're receptive to thinking about these issues. And I think it involves subtlety and poetry, and I think Maya Lin's installation at Madison Square Park is a good example of that. So with that in mind, I'm going to introduce our panelists in the order in which they are making their presentations. So I'm going to start with Anita, and you'll have to excuse me reading from my screen, which is right here. Anita Fields was born in Oklahoma. She works primarily in clay and textiles that reflect the worldview of her native Osage culture. She earned her Bachelor of Fine Arts from Oklahoma State University and had additional training at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. She's done multiple residencies for students and communities throughout her career. She was a 2017 to 2020 fellow with the Kaiser Foundation Tulsa Artist Fellowship. Her work is in many collections, including the Minneapolis Institute of Art, the Museum of Arts and Design in New York, the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts in Santa Fe, the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas, the Heard Museum in Phoenix, and the National Museum of the American Indian in at the Smithsonian in DC. Allison Janae Hamilton has lived and worked in New York since 2006. She was born and raised in Northern Florida. She's exhibited her work at institutions like MoMA PS1, the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, and has had solo shows, notably at Mass MoCA and elsewhere. She was a 2013 to 2014 fellow at the Whitney Independent Study Program and has been awarded residencies at the Studio Museum in Harlem, among other institutions. She's the recipient of the Creative Capital Award, the Rima Hort Mann Foundation grant, and her work is in private and public collections, including the Studio Museum, the Menil. She got her PhD in American Studies from NYU and her MFA in Visual Arts from Columbia University. And I'll just add that last year she was included in an article on Artsy about 10 artists who are, quote unquote, making urgent work about the environment, end quote. And her exhibition, I think this is really interesting, earlier this year at Marion Boesky Gallery was the first carbon conscious show that the gallery has put on. Last December, she had an installation of her videos of Southern landscapes at Brooklyn Bridge Park, incidentally a flood zone, in New York, a project put on by Creative Time. Lucia, and now I'm going to butcher your last name, but it's unavoidable, isn't it? Lucia Pietroiusti is the founder and curator of General Ecology, which is an ongoing project at London's Serpentine Galleries. So in celebration of its 50th anniversary, the Serpentine had planned to dedicate the entire year of 2020 to ecological concerns. Of course, the pandemic put a wrench in the works there, so there will be some programming over the next few years related to that, which Lucia is very involved in. She was also the curator of the 2019 Venice Biennale's Golden Lion Award-winning Lithuanian Pavilion, which was called Sun and Sea Marina, which was essentially a live opera set up on a real beach, which was all the sand and everything transported to this building in Venice. And these artists created essentially an opera. I mean, I saw it was incredible. An opera where they look like ordinary people on a beach, but they are singing their arias and so forth about climate change and how it sort of affects their everyday lives. Incredible piece. And I'll just say one quote that I came across from you, Lucia, that I thought was great. You said, "A tree can't be a curator," which none of us can argue against. So I want to dive right in. Anita, I think you are giving your presentation first, so I will hand the mic over to you and mute myself.
All right. Well, I thank you for this opportunity, and I'm coming today. I'm here with you from Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm at my studio with the Tulsa Artist Fellowship. And do we have the images that I'm seeing? Yes, we could just leave that up. So in my work, I am informed by the thoughts, beliefs, and knowledge systems left to me by my Osage ancestors, who understood that life is but a mirror of nature and the cosmos. With the knowledge found from observing nature over eons of time, our worldview acknowledges our relationship to the earth, sky, and water. My work reflects the early Osage notions of duality, such as earth, sky, night, day, sun, moon, and male and female. And unfortunately, we live in a time where there is an incredible disconnect from the natural world with little or no regard to the importance of our environment. By articulating the concepts of balance and the symbiotic relationships found throughout life and nature, I hope to deepen our understanding of the intersection of all living things. My work is a response to the powerful mysteries found within the earth and the physical world. I am privileged to transform and shape the earth, and working with clay for over 50 years has taught me many lessons, as it is embodied with many human-like characteristics. I have found the moist earth to be strong, resilient, yet fragile. It is forgiving and patient, and at its most basic form, as a bowl or a vessel, it mimics our human form. Clay holds the history and transformation of place and time within its molecular makeup. I have been fortunate to visit the last documented Osage village and other important lands significant to our displacement and history of removal. These powerful experiences led me to begin creating slab-built landscapes. They are symbolic of the spiritual and cultural memory found throughout the terrain of our original homelands and sacred places. In the piece titled Movement of the Sun, gold discs represent the daily journey of the sun from the east to the west over the earth, and how we as Osage mark the passage of time in a transcendent sense. It is a metaphor for the journey that we as humans also take. We can see the next image, please. In What the Earth Knows, we see the quick and transient forces of nature that are expressed throughout this enclosed clay form. An impressive and potentially dangerous storm rolls forward to meet the earth. As the tornado approaches, its compelling winds and funnel obliterates color from the skies, suppressing the atmosphere and leaving the space looking like a black and white photograph. It symbolizes the truths found in the powerful forces of nature. The distorted writing seen on the left underscores our fragile relationship to the environment and how we cannot, no matter how we ever try, control nature. The work that I make signifies a continuum of thought, cultural knowledge, and the essence of who we are as Indigenous people living in a modern, chaotic, and challenging world. Thank you.
That was great to hear, Anita. And we will move on to, I believe Allison is up next. So I will hand it over to you. I want to make sure I'm right about that. Yes, I am. So I'm muting myself. Go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. It's really nice to be with y'all today. So I'm Allison Janae Hamilton. My work really centers on landscape as the main character in this ecosystem of characters and fables and some fiction and reality kind of all blended together. Sarah talked about in the beginning, and I look at folklore as a metaphor for human experience, and my kind of angle with regards to environmental justice or climate change really comes from the land itself and the people living within and their lived experience. Like Sarah said, I was raised in North Florida. I was actually born in Kentucky, and Anita, my family lived in Stillwater actually for a few short years as well. So I really am focusing on the southern, southeastern United States as well, and the culture and traditions that come from the region. And so for this particular work, which was installed in 2018 at Storm King Art Center, I was looking at the history of hurricanes and the way that the social disasters of these storms are really part and parcel with the natural disaster of a hurricane. So at the time that I was invited to do this, Hurricane Maria had just happened in Puerto Rico. And of course, not only was it devastating in terms of the actual storm, but also the response or lack of response and everything that surrounded that. So I began to think about Hurricane Katrina, the Galveston storm, the Sea Islands hurricanes. And so I just drew that history. And so this, The People Cried Mercy in the Storm, that title comes from a shape note hymn, a secular hymn that I found of African-American singers in the northern Florida and Alabama coast, reflecting on the Great Miami Hurricane of 1926. And the same year that that song was published, the Okeechobee hurricane came, which was also the backdrop for Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, and thousands of Black migrant workers were buried in these mass unmarked graves. And so I began to think, as these storms get more and more intense, the seasons are getting longer, the storms are more frequent. Last season, we were down into the Greek alphabet in terms of the named storms. I'm thinking and considering, who is at most risk and who's most vulnerable as climate change continues to increase. And so I'm thinking through all these different ways that it's affecting people disproportionately. I think we can move on to the next slide, which I think is just another angle of the same piece. So it's partly memorial, it's partly performative with the tambourine symbols, which also bring in the spirituality and ritual and resilience of the region and culture as well. And the next one, I believe, is a video. So I'm gonna stop talking and let the video play. This was in Times Square just this past April. Well, I'll say a little something. This is, I shot it in my home region in Northern Florida in the Big Bend area. This is the Wassissa River. And we had just had Hurricane Matthew that had hit. But the interesting thing about this, the haunting thing about this river system too, is that it's bisected by the Slave Canal, which, as the name suggests, was dug out by the labor of enslaved people. And the purpose was to bring cotton from Georgia through our little narrow strip of northern Florida to ships waiting in the Gulf of Mexico. So this is taking viewers through the Wassissa River. And so basically this, this piece brings together two key ideas: climate change with hurricanes. There are felled trees that are in the floor of the river there at the top of the screen, and also the history of labor and forced labor in Greek Island history, all happening at the same time. Thank you very much.
That was hypnotic. I think we could have gone on watching it for the entire time and just forgotten about talking. I'll turn to Lucia. Lucia is going to speak less about her position and everything that it entails, I think, and more about an argument that she is making about art's effectiveness in this area. I'm going to hand it over to her.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for sharing this time. And thank you so much, Alison and Anita, for sharing your beautiful and powerful work. So I'm going to do a blend of the two, in fact. I work at the Serpentine in London as curator of general ecology, which is a project that I conceived in 2018 as an experiment to make a structural change to an organization, one that would attune an art organization to a more than human world and towards environmental justice and environmental balance. And today I wanted to indeed make the case to you that art, that is to say, imagination, narrative, abstraction, myth, and memory, visual art, performance, so art and the stuff of the world, meaning earth, ground, animals, mountains, minerals, and plants, are in fact one and the same. And I want to suggest to you that art is an incredibly practical thing, one that concerns the real world and holds knowledge about it. And indeed, art may even be the most resilient technology that we have ever come up with as a species. So here are some snapshots from the General Ecology Project. 3 years ago, the writer and editor Filipa Ramos and I began by looking at this image. A tiny pufferfish in the center shuffles about, moving sand around, and makes this fantastic shape. Biologists describe this circle as part of a mating ritual. We might look at it and think of art, that this fish is an artist. But to this tiny fish, if we could shrink right into that fish's mind, then surely the shape of that circle is not a circle at all, but actually a set of movements, a kind of sand shuffle, a sort of a dance. And from this, Filipa and I developed the shape of a circle in the mind of a fish, a multi-year research project and festival series that looks at consciousness, intelligence, and language across species, convening artists, anthropologists, theologians, scientists, and much more. And our first instinct there was this shift of perspective from the circle to the dance. And over time, we've devoted the series to chipping away at various anthropocentric assumptions, including this quote that keeps following me around, that a tree can't be a curator, because I kind of disagree with it now. After all, saying that a forest is capable of generosity is not necessarily to anthropomorphize a forest, but maybe rather to suggest that human generosity could be a complex emergence from a larger, more distributed kind of generosity, more than human generosity. Same with love, same with desire, same with will, same with potentially everything, divinity too. So I will now read you a piece of this poetry. That day you seemed to me a tall palm tree, and your breasts the clusters of its fruit. I said in my heart, let me climb into that palm tree and take hold of its branches, etc. So this passage is from the Song of Songs, which dates back somewhere between the 10th and the 2nd centuries BCE. Here, a couple is in a garden, and the perfumes, textures, and seductiveness of plants become a metaphor for erotic, or, depending on interpretation, divine love. But what if we read it the other way around? Maybe then the speaker, by associating the lover and a palm tree, might actually be referring to date tree fertilization, an interspecies human plant agricultural practice dating as far back as the 5th or 6th millennium BCE, and which was in fact the backbone of Mesopotamian civilizations for millennia. Seen in this way, poetry, art, myth, and stories transmit an agricultural practice through deep time. They are instruction manuals for interspecies relations. I will close by briefly speaking of the General Ecology Project. If metaphor and material, abstraction and stuff can be connected, can be maybe even one and the same, then it follows that thinking about a forest may require thinking with and also like a forest as well. So the General Ecology Project, the General Ecology Project works like a forest. Its manifestations flower and fruit at different times and at different speeds and operate at the level of programming and discourse, as well as infrastructure and systems. And while we think of planetary ecologies as systems, we also think of the system of the project itself as a complex environment, and we organize ourselves and our work in accordance to this principle. And our next step, as Sarah mentioned, is Back to Earth, a project that invites 65 artists to propose an artwork that is also an environmental campaign, initiative, prototype, or intervention. And we're making our slow way through these and realizing that it is the structure of the organization that needs to change in order to support them, becoming adherent to the needs and the specificity of each specific project. Thank you very much.
Well, as usually happens, I have to throw away my notes and start all over because I see so many connections now after actually hearing your presentations that I would love to talk about. I think just coming off, Lucia, what you were just speaking about, I couldn't help but think, and it's something we haven't mentioned about Anita's work. The idea of transformation, Anita, is so central to your own project. And throughout what Lucia was saying, there's discussion of seeing things from another perspective, perhaps seeing things from the perspective of an animal, thinking about myths. I couldn't help but think of the myth of the god or goddess who turns into a tree to escape a suitor. I can't remember who it is. There's a great old master painting in London's National Gallery that refers to this. But Anita, I was hoping you could talk about, some of what Lucia is talking about in her programming, and even the idea of transformation of an institution. I would love to hear about how your ideas of transformation connect with this, switching of perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in transformation, that there are so many things that are involved in that. I mean, I can just start with the material, that I use, and I mentioned that, and what I said is that the earth, the clay, it just lends itself to that idea of transformation, and that's exactly what it does. It takes one form and turns into something else. But included in that is that transformation of self, and how you see yourself within the environment you live in. And a reflection of how you view the earth and our relationship to it. So transformation, is evident in so many of the things that I do. I also work with textiles. So, I deal with, work with clothing and the idea of transformation, how it enables us to transform not just an object, but, our hearts and our spirits and our minds. So yeah, transformation is very big in my work. And again, that's based on, I'm so embedded in this idea of the Osage worldview and the philosophies because I think it's so beautiful. I could just stay within that all of the time because, it really was based on this observation of the earth and how everything's interconnected. That each little thing is a key to the big puzzle. And so in that aspect, I see ourselves as part of that. And this was simply, understanding, she mentioned, like animals and observation of this relationship, like even in animals, how they take care of one another, how they, many of our clan names in our Osage language, so our language is really embedded with this idea of transformation. Talk specifically about these actions that we see take place in the world in terms of like, an animal or an object or something that's found within the environment that was key to our survival.
Sorry, I was on mute. I want to turn to Allison here because one of the things I couldn't help but think about when we were watching the Times Square installation was, first of all, there have been many installations as part of that project, the Midnight Minute, I think it's called Midnight Moment, where artists put up videos, throughout these panels that usually show advertising and so forth. But what ends up happening is you're seeing the artist project against the backdrop of advertising and just generally sort of the built environment or the sort of popular culture environment. And I guess my question for you is, first of all, I think you're seeing your installation, it's so much more affecting than some of the others I've seen because of the contrast, right, between nature and culture and so on and so forth. Of course, you told us the backstory, of what that is, what that river is and its meaning and so forth. I wonder what you want the effect to be on someone who is standing there in Times Square who doesn't know that whole backstory. Because once you know it, you think, okay, this is what our culture is built on, right? And it all comes together. But what is the effect you're going for a person who's just standing in Times Square? Because that's your audience there.
Right. I think that's a really great question, Sarah. It relates to a lot of my work in general. I never try to be didactic in the work. I'm never trying to make it an overt kind of teachable moment. But what I do is I try to embed the affect or the emotional resonance of what I'm looking at in the textures of the work. So even if you don't know anything about the Wassasa River, where it is, what it's for, or if you don't know about the Slave Canal, if you don't know the history of hurricanes in the region, you know that something is off kilter. The trees are at the top of the screen. There are kind of haunting elements that's just built into the texture of the work. And it's a little bit unsettling or destabilizing. And so whether I'm presenting a sculpture or a video installation or a single channel video or photographs, I always try to have a little bit of that in the work so that if you're kind of standing there without the context, you still get this impression that there's something deeper than what meets the eye with this landscape. And that's with all landscapes, right? Every landscape on the planet has a history. And oftentimes that history is bound up with violent labor practices or some kind of trauma. And so, just having that moment of like, something is off here. For me, that's enough as an artist. And if someone, digs deeper and kind of dives in and spends more time with the work or follows the different kind of chapters of the work, I'm really inspired by these, epic mythology. And so, I enjoyed hearing what you were talking about earlier. But I think of each body of work almost like a chapter in a really long epic. So some people might follow from one to the next, or some people might come across something for the first time or not have all of the context. But I hope that whether you kind of see it on the surface or dig deeper, that there's some emotional affectation there that really keys into an idea of destabilization or disturbance.
Yeah, I have to say it's interesting to hear you say that about the chapters, because when I saw your project at Mass MoCA, I actually did, just in a kind of vague way, and maybe he's not a good reference these days, but it did put me in mind of sort of Faulkner and the county that he made up and the kind of complete vision of that he was able to put forth in his novels, and how through your work I was getting a sense of a place that had stories within it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that really comes across. Lucia, in an interview that you gave with ArtNet a couple years ago, you said the effects of climate change are unequally distributed on a planetary scale. The climate targets are established on the notion of that global north being protected from climate disaster. It's not for me to be the representative of this conversation. To consider these representational and ecological concerns in tandem is where the real challenge begins. I want to hear you talk about, but I just want to hear Allison for a second, because I couldn't help but think when I read that, I thought, well, that's kind of part and parcel of your project, Allison, is to show the unequal way in which people are affected depending on where they live by climate change. And I hoped you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Another thing that I'm thinking about constantly in the work is destabilizing the existing myths about climate change and environmentalism. And one of those is that it's this kind of looming entity that's coming slowly for us all. And that's not it at all. I mean, for some people, the effects of climate change are something that they deal with daily now, you know, and this is all stratified by things, class, race, of course, and you know, there's no coincidence that communities of color are the communities that are on the wrong side of that levee when that hurricane or flood comes. Or, you know, these things have been structured in, you know, in the aftermath of American slavery, for example, people were put in different locations and given certain types of tracts of land that were either the worst agriculturally or the most vulnerable to the climate, to the shore, things like that. And so I'm really emphasizing that these are not kind of happenstance conditions, and that this is really the structural inequity comes right along with what's happening with nature. And the irony of that is that nature, you would think that it's universal, right? But humans come along and you know, we kind of mess it all up. So, but in all of these different variegated ways that are not necessarily, I think things are changing now, but have not historically been at the forefront of these conversations on climate change. A study just came out recently about American voters, and I believe you know, a lot of people found that jarring. But in terms of you know, who cares the most about climate change? It was Black Americans, you know. And so when you think of, you know, if you close your eyes and think of an environmentalist, that's not necessarily the face that you see. You know, my elder aunts and cousins and relatives who could tell you anything about climate change. You know, my family, my Tennessee family, who are farmers, they know all about the debate because it affects their daily life and agriculture business. So, but yet, you know, these are not the voices that are always part of the climate change conversation. And so that's also kind of why I really wanted to always emphasize, you know, the lived experience with the land and bringing the land at the forefront, but the characters are right there, kind of on equal frame. You know, a lot of times the characters in my photographs are centered, which is kind of something that a lot of photographers see as a no-no, but I like to have it all kind of an equal plane, because you can't divorce the human experience with this narrative of the landscape itself.
Well, I can't help but think, Lucia, I want to turn to you now, but that maybe next time we should have at the Venice Biennale a farm transported and hear farmers singing an opera about how it's affecting them, because I may be wrong and I may be remembering it incorrectly, but I think for the most part, these were people on that beach kind of almost complaining about how their leisure time has been affected by this. There's a question that came in that actually I ask you, Lucia, as you're responding to what Allison said as well, that's about the Serpentine's sort of commitment. What's the ongoing commitment to what you're doing? And when you and I spoke before the panel, what I thought was so interesting, and I think this goes a certain way towards answering that question, is how your position evolved. So I hope that you could walk us through that, you know, including the work with Gustav Metzger and so on and so forth, and how the institution and the audience became receptive to this kind of thing. And then if you could extend us into the future and what is the ongoing commitment?
Yes, of course. I'm going to do the first bit first, which is to, let's say, like kind of emphatically and wholeheartedly agree with the response that Allison you've given to Sarah's question, and just to kind of spend a minute to think about that in a situation in which we need to absolutely kind of come to terms with incredible, challenging complexities. It might be one of the things that really that was sort of incredibly important throughout the research around general ecology and the shape of a circle and the mind of a fish was to think about this idea of anthropocentrism and realizing that a kind of post-anthropocentrism is not, or an anti-anthropocentrism is not kind of opposing itself to the centrality of the human as a species, because the anthropos in anthropocentrism set up throughout, you know, around the time of the Enlightenment, kind of the parameters of which were set up by the European Enlightenment, was not all humans to begin with, was never all humans to begin with, was a hegemonic, violent culture of a specific group of humans. And let's remind ourselves that the relationship between that is incredible. It's not just imaginary, it's incredibly material. That the Enlightenment was funded by gold that was mined in the Americas, right? So, and that entire sort of apparatus of that entire transaction was went together with genocide, extraction, environmental destruction, and enslavement. And so that's all to say that whilst, as I did say in that article, it is not my place to speak on behalf of those experiences whatsoever. It is the ambition of a project such as General Ecology to try and be accurate to the facts, and those are facts. And the notion of centering environmental justice is, to me, a kind of a fact, the needing of centering environmental justice. As to your second point, the project was conceived in a sort of non-confrontational kind of way through the idea of proposing a project which set itself a kind of task of, can an organization hypothetically be influenced to kind of recode its own sense of purpose towards some notion of environmentalism or the environmental justice and balance? And how would it go about that? So I was in a position at the time of being curator of live and public programs, so anything kind of time-based, broadly speaking, had a certain set of points of agency around programming, around how to distribute budget, around things like this, and therefore started from the easiest possible thing, which was to start to program things about the environment. And I would do so in a way that became almost like ridiculous. Like, oh, there's a show about this. Okay, well, if I really sort of stretch the concept, we can do this thing about the environment. And it sort of kept going. And the strange thing happened is that it sort of, the project then, the other part of it, sorry, was that changing the job title was kind of cool and fun for me, but the idea behind it was, can we make a structural change to an organization? Like that, can that become a position, from a position to a department, from a department to kind of an established part of the structure? So around this programming emerged a kind of community of audience members who mirrored back at the Serpentine an image of itself as an institution that consistently and obsessively kind of spoke about environmental questions or ecology. And that kind of prompted the institution to ask itself, well, what are the internal kind of processes that we need to undertake in order to kind of live into, step into, live up to, match those kinds of expectations. And so the work, but the ping pong between kind of what's visible and what's programmatic and discursive and what's invisible, infrastructural, kind of sometimes tedious and organizational is a constant dynamic that I think by thinking a little bit in systems terms, we try to sort of float between with the project.
I don't want to go too far down this road because it is a very complex thing, but I think that what was implied also, which I didn't convey in the question that came in, is that the Serpentine is a very, I think no one would deny, is an extremely experimental and sort of, I would say, though you may think differently, a sort of malleable institution. Do you think it is possible for larger, more sort of hidebound institutions to embrace something like that?
I think it entirely depends on where it emerges and how it goes about itself. I think a microscopic virus can halt the entire infrastructure of the entire world. So the answer is absolutely yes. It's just about finding that specific point of agency. And yes, you're absolutely right that the Serpentine's kind of tendency to hand over some relative autonomy to specific branches of process-driven work played a big factor. So the big challenge is the big challenge that I'm looking kind of forward to is to, can we open source some of this methodology? How can we turn it into a curriculum? How can we bring it to another place? Or not bring it to another place, or just be available to sort of respond to the way that it might manifest in other places and so on.
Well, one of the things I hear you saying, which is so interesting, is that it almost has to be an organic process rather than a top-down, here's what we're doing thing, and it has to have the buy-in from people throughout the institution as well as the audience. I think that's how most great things happen, by the way. I'm kind of merging the Q&A with the discussion, which I think is a good way of doing things, hopefully. And one of the questions that came across, which is something I wanted to ask anyhow, is the question of the materials you use as an artist. Are there, ecological concerns that come in when you're thinking about your carbon footprint? I want to turn to Anita first, and then Allison, I'd love to hear about, that there was the show at Boski that they were able to, do that with, and to talk about your own materials. Anita, I remember when we were speaking, you mentioned a situation where an artist said that there was a kind of small budget for something that was happening. I don't know, maybe it was in a park, and the artist said, well, don't worry, a good artist can make art out of anything. And I loved the idea of talking about sort of available materials. And of course, your use of clay, technically is an available, a material that the earth makes available to us. And I wondered if that's something you think about in your work.
Sure. I think that there are places, because clay is extracted in so many different ways throughout the world and in different regions, whether it's commercial or people extract it, as individuals, you can rob that place of what is available to you. But, I also think of it as it's being replenished also, just because of how it is, the factors that are involved in considering time and, the breakdown of the earth and all of the elements that come into play, in the creation of clay that you can utilize. And I think of, when I think of materials, I think of well-appointed studios, that we're all familiar with, that have the most up-to-date equipment in terms of like a slab roller wheels, high-tech kilns and all this kind of thing. In reality, all that you need is water and the earth and a fire. And man has been making them, probably one of the earliest expressions that have ever been made through art is by using clay. So it goes hand in hand, with who we are as human beings, in order to make this expression of utilizing things from the earth. And yeah, that story, it was a friend was trying to get funding for a festival, and the funder was really worried about, like, how much is this going to cost in terms of supplies? And she said, well, the people that I have in mind, can make art out of anything that's found in that park. And that's how I feel a lot of times. And sometimes I just challenge myself, even within my own studio, just use what's here. You don't need any more than what is here, what is available to you.
And then Allison, I wanted to ask, in the show you did it at Boski, for instance, there are quite a few found materials in there, from the fencing masks and the feathers and so forth. And then I was also thinking, though, about your project at Mass MoCA, which made use of trees. And I wonder if you can talk about what is the responsibility in sourcing materials and thinking about one's carbon footprint as an artist.
Yeah, so I think you're getting at a couple different things. So for the show a couple months ago, yes, that was the first carbon neutral show at the gallery. So what we did there was we basically tracked the carbon footprint that went into each of the artworks, and through various measures, including kind of tax built into acquisitions, we offset that. But in terms of my studio practice and just working with my own materials, that's something that's just always been natural to me. I think just even culturally, again, coming from farmers on my mom's side of the family, my great grandmother and aunts, they were all hunters and they fished, and just having this idea of using everything or using all, not discarding. And so when I do use natural materials, they're either something that has literally fallen off, like a dead palm frond, or they might be feathers that were from another industry that would have just been thrown in the garbage, or family friends or friends of friends who I know are hunting and would have thrown away the hide anyway. I'll say, well, can I have the skins? You know, and so it's always something that would have been trash. The fencing masks are found vintage antique items. So that's just kind of part of the natural practice of the work, or just kind of was always just part of my inclination when you deal with natural material. I think there's just an element of respect that I was just raised with when it comes to anything relating to nature or something that is passed on, or so I think that just kind of came naturally. But then, you know, as an artist, then that folded into the studio practice. But then again, kind of in a more explicit manner, in terms of thinking about shipping and all these different things that go into making an artwork. If I have to ship some kind of adhesive from somewhere, like, okay, well, it's going from this zip code to this zip code, and what is the cost of that? So that kind of doing that math and really getting granular on that has also been an interesting process. That is also that was part of the recent project.
Yeah, when you were talking, Anita, and also Allison, I was thinking about something that Maya Lin talks about, which is that, you know, why should we not mow our lawns? It's actually because the actual equipment that people use to mow, when they ship it on these, you know, big boats, that uses up energy. So you have to kind of trace it back to, it's like, oh, you know, I have this cherry picker in my studio, but, you know, how did it get to where it is and what was used in the whole process? And again, as usual, I was thinking about, well, you know, Kurt Schwitters wasn't a collage artist, he was an upcycler of materials. I want to make sure we are not skipping over some of our questions from the audience, because we do have to wrap up relatively soon, although I have so many more things I could ask, but I want to make sure we are addressing this. One of the things that came over here through the chat was actually a question for you, Anita. How specifically do you source your clay?
I personally use a commercial clay. And then within that, you know, I recycle and use all my scraps and, you know, regenerate clay bodies through that. So, yeah.
And another question has to do with, you know, I mean, we've been talking about all kinds of art, but of course we're sort of talking in the context of public art. And there was a question that had to do, I think that is touching on, you know, what we were talking about with Allison's piece in Times Square is, you know, the idea of presenting this to a public, and what role does the public play, and how do you account for that kind of audience when you're making work that has to do with ecological concerns? I mean, I guess, Allison, I would ask you also about the piece at Brooklyn Bridge Park. And maybe if you heard of some of the reactions to that, it would be interesting to know, you know, what they were.
Yeah, a lot of the reactions to that had to do with the kind of juxtaposition of the landscape and the city skyline. So for those who hadn't seen the Creative Time presentation in Brooklyn Bridge Park, it was similar to the Times Square presentation that I showed today, in that you have that city country kind of mashup happening. It was a 5-channel installation, and the backdrop was the New York skyline, and then you had the video screens in front of you that pulled from my family landscapes in northern Florida, and I think a bit of Tennessee as well. So a lot of the responses had to do with that, and so that was interesting to me, because I think you can't help but then link the history of both places, and then you begin to think about the history of port cities and port locations, and how that plays into the environment. So for me, the connection between the two was something. Oh, Saisha says the frozen tundra contrasting with humid Florida. Yeah, it was in December in New York City, and I don't know if y'all remember, there was that snowstorm, and so you had this very swampy North Florida landscape with the snow and everything. So yeah, I think that it was that seemingly disparate combination that engendered a lot of interesting responses.
So I know I have to wrap up, or Brooke, I'm going to get in trouble with Brooke because it is 10:02. But I would just want to draw attention to, there was a question that had to do with, speaking with the artists. How do you feel that environmental art can help us bridge the divide and, so to speak, make kin with nature as well as with each other? And if we had more time, which we don't, and Anita has done many, many projects with communities and with students, and has had them working with clay with her. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about that is the creation of bonds, not just between people and materials, but between people, and how that can lead to further conversations. And I would direct you to looking at some of the projects that she's done. And I think we have to stop immediately, yes. But thank you all for being here and working with me and enlightening all of us. And what I always say about a panel, when it's great, which I think this one was, is like, I learned something in the process of talking to all of you. And I hope that our audience did too, and will now take some action. And with that, we will say goodbye.
Good morning. My name is Truth Marie Cole, and I'm the curatorial manager at Madison Square Park Conservancy. Thank you, Sarah Douglas, Anita Fields, Allison Janae Hamilton, and Lucia Pietruschi for your inspiring panel discussion. And now, we are thrilled to begin our keynote conversation with artist Maya Lin and environmental leaders Maria Rodell of Rodell Institute, Bill Ohlfelder, Executive Director of the Nature Conservancy in New York, and Edwina Van Gaal, founder of Perfect Earth Project. Our moderator is journalist Andrew Revkin of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Their bios can be found in the chat. They will discuss nature-based solutions to climate change. The keynote conversation was filmed live in Maya Lin's Ghost Forest last week. The keynote will be followed by a live Q&A, so please add any questions to the chat.
It's just marvelous to be here in Madison Square Park, especially after a year and a quarter of sitting in my room in the Hudson Valley, running a lot of online conversations, not on Zoom, but in boxes. And now here we are back on a green space, Madison Square Park, for greening public art, to discuss not just this piece, Ghost Forests from Maya Lin, but the wider concepts of how do we engage audiences around the unbelievably urgent but complicated challenge of fitting human aspirations on a finite planet. That's been my beat for more than 35 years, mostly for the New York Times. And I was honored. I've gotten to know Maya through her many years of work as a real innovator on this question of engagement, right back to when you were an undergrad at Yale, and with your work online, What is Missing? .net is a great online experiment in engagement and using data as a storytelling mechanism. And here, you're back to the physicality of taking trees from one place that sadly have been destroyed by salinization, by this intrusions of water where it wasn't, and they provide a testament to what we're facing. So today I'll be helping to foster a discussion with you, with Bill Ohlfelder, who's the executive director of the Nature Conservancy in New York, which is the whole state, right? And
correct, and
which is a big
connects
place,
to a larger organization.
From the Adirondacks to
Montauk,
urban ecology to you're deeply involved on especially the land connection to climate. Maria Rodell, who has a century-long lineage in her family of working with the land, although until today I didn't realize that Jerome Rodell, the founder of that effort, organic agriculture, came from New York City, from the tenements. So there's much to learn about all of our experiences, both within cities and connecting to the wider landscapes around us. And Edwina Van Gaal, who is a landscape designer in the Hamptons, out on the far end of Long Island, and has Perfect Earth Project. We'll learn more about that as well. Great to see all of you here today, face to face, vaccinated, and with hope for the future. But I would love to hear from you first, Maya, on what's your goal here and what drives you these days as an artist greening, the conversation here is about greening public art.
Yeah, and I think I have a few slides that I'll be talking over, and I think I'm just so happy that all of you agreed to be here. Ghost Forest started as an idea where how could I, as an artist who tends to make permanent, fairly large-scale earthworks, how could I make a temporary piece in downtown Manhattan? It took me maybe 7 years, and I was in Colorado looking out at our landscape, which faces the Rocky Mountain Range in southwestern Colorado, and there are vast tracts of forest dying out there because of beetles that are surviving warmer winters. Right. And so I proposed to Madison Square Park Conservancy, could I bring a ghost forest to downtown Manhattan? Could I raise awareness about a really horrible fact of these forests are dying out around the world? And also I didn't want to do something that wasn't close to home. So then I started working very closely with the Conservancy to find the closest victims of climate change, because again, these are all, this phenomenon of ghost forests is happening throughout the world. It's happening quite rapidly. And depending upon, is it forest fires, is it droughts, is it saltwater inundation? And so everyone, I think Edwina was one of the first people I called, she said, look to the Pine Barrens. And sadly, the Pine Barrens, which used to have 50% more coverage of the whole Atlantic seaboard, has been lost due to changes in climate, most recently as a great threat. But before that, the forestry practices, and also the minute they got cleared, a lot of our cities were built off of these great ancient woods. Then the pioneer species, the species that grow up quickly, would shade out the light. So there are forestry practices now in place that are restoring these forests through kind of a larger clearing, and then the trees can kind of come back. The forest you're in right now, 49 trees, was dying off because a nearby estuarine river was seeping through, and all these trees had the beginning signs of tree rot. So I think on a 10 o'clock at night, on a cold spring day, 49 trees arrived in Manhattan, and we placed them throughout. I think I needed to be very respectful of the surrounding trees, right, so that we had to be away from the root canopies. And I wanted to create a grove that anyone could wander through. COVID played deeply on our minds, so we're in one of the largest openings in the grove, but there are those that get smaller, but always so that you could feel fairly comfortable with 2 or 3 people. And so the first slides are all about that. But for me, as an activist as well, I started, what is missing? I couldn't just focus on loss. And the reason we're here and the reason we're kicking off the entire project is twofold. You'll see that I think with Natural Areas Conservancy, in the fall, 1,000 trees and shrubs will be planted. We calced that over the last 3 years, it took us about 5.3 tons of carbon to make and plan and install the piece. And we've calculated, or the Conservancy's calculated, that over the next 10 years, those 1,000 trees will absorb 60 tons of carbon. So we neutralized the piece actually tenfold. But more than that, we're all here today to offer larger picture solutions. I'm going to emphasize throughout what is missing that 49% of all emissions is caused by land use. It also is a main driver of species extinction. I think over 50% of all species are on a path to extinction by 2100. It's dire, but if you combine them, I call it, we can save 2 birds with 1 tree. We can both, by protecting and restoring habitats, we can both protect species and reduce emissions. So I think, I was really influenced by an artwork, Charles and Ray Eames, The Powers of 10. So I think we're all in sort of an order where the Nature Conservancy is sort of working at a much, sort of the macro picture about restoring degraded lands, urban lands, forests, grasslands. Maria, I've been learning from your institute's reports on how much restoring and reforming our agricultural practices can both protect soil to make it much more moisture absorbent,
Right.
as well as feed more people. And it's our only hope. And then, of course, let's bring it home to your own backyard. What can each one of us do in our own backyards that can both bring life back to the soil so we can absorb emissions as well as invite biodiversity back? So that's sort of what I'm doing here, and I'm just really honored that all of us came together and we all had to get out of the box and get out of Zoom to be here
Yeah.
today.
One of the things that's become clear to me as a journalist and writing about this stuff for so long is the restorative power of a landscape after it's been hammered. And so, Bill, when you think about this issue, how much of it is about protecting what's left of nature, meaning pristine forests, and how much is it about us developing a different relationship with land?
This really takes community. It takes the city community, the regional community, and the global community. So to be able to have this opportunity here amidst your installation, Maya, is fabulous. And it's really a combination of things. But I do want to emphasize just how dire things are and are getting. And so the Nature Conservancy's been doing the analysis of the flooding of New York, and it's dramatic what's going to happen here. I mean, we're not just Manhattan, which interestingly, basically all the zones that were filled in over centuries are what goes first.
Right.
But it's Brooklyn, it's Queens, it's Long Island. I mean, there are millions of properties, there are billions and billions of dollars of community businesses and homes that are all at stake here. And it's going to really take a key effort. And the Nature Conservancy, for us, it really is that combination, because our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends, but it's really about the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. And if you do great nature conservation and restore nature, you're actually addressing both. And so we did the study about 2 years ago that, basically looking out to the end of this decade on the road to the Paris Accord, you see that reforestation is a massive driver of the potential. And this is not a sophisticated, expensive, unknown technology.
No.
It's trees.
Right.
This is just putting trees in the ground.
Right.
That takes you an incredibly long way.
Right.
And then, of course, there is the conservation of standing forests. And we are continuing to lose forests, whether that's
Right.
here in New York or the Amazon around the world. And those two, along with obviously soil management practices in farming and livestock production. Wetlands are like a superpower, the amount of carbon that they absorb for a small area. So it really is about all of nature, but trees have a really big role, whether you're planting them or conserving them in place.
Right,
Yeah.
that's great. And turning to Maria Rodale, how we till the earth matters too. Heading toward 9 billion people on a finite planet, all having some reasonable diet is a huge challenge. Even taking away the waste, if we stop wasting, that takes away a big chunk of things, but we still have to figure out ways to grow either more efficiently on land that is already in agriculture, or if anything new is ever developed for agriculture, it has to really have a small footprint. So you've written a couple of books, Organic Manifesto, Scratch, which is how to cook from scratch, literally from the stuff that comes out of the ground. And you guys have done these great long-term tests of organic farming methods. So what's your vision of where we go from here? And what do you draw from this too?
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Maya. And I agree, it's really an honor to be here and a pleasure. And I have some slides about the farming systems trial, which is the longest running study comparing organic to chemical, best practice chemical, including GMO agriculture in the world. And it's been replicated many times over in other places. And so I have some figures. After 40 years, we now know that organic systems, regenerative organic systems, are competitive with conventional yields. They use 45% less fossil fuels. They earn 3 to 6 times greater profits for farmers, and they leach no toxic chemicals because it's organic into the waterways, the air, the environment, or our bodies. And 40% fewer carbon and greenhouse emissions are released, as well as the soil stores 16% more carbon within it. And especially in times of drought and flood, which, as you know, climate change brings more of, the organic systems are much more resilient. Because the soil is so alive and rich, it holds water during droughts, and it also absorbs water during floods. So, but I'm assuming that most of the people watching this are not farmers and really want to know kind of.
But a lot of them are probably backyard farmers since pandemic hit.
Yeah, and
I think there's been a huge boon in backyard gardening.
And one of the things that kind of I observe as a person who's been steeped in all this information is that a lot of people and the world likes to make things complicated, but it's really simple. It's really simple. And if we can kind of convey the simplicity, what I'd like to do is explain the important things. So first of all, plants are essential. All plants, trees, crops, cover crops, herbs, lawns, any single plant is important to storing carbon, including parks and ocean plants, like kelp and phytoplankton. All those plants absorb carbon from the atmosphere and hold it in the ground. That natural carbon cycle is what humans have messed up by using chemicals. Because when you kill the organisms in the ground, with fungicides and herbicides and insecticides, the soil can't do what it is meant to do. And like in 1 tablespoon of living organic soil, there's billions and billions of creatures.
Right.
And that's true in a forest, it's true in a farm, it's true in your lawn. As I like to say, nature prefers to wear plants. The second thing is that animals are essential. There's a lot of controversy about what to eat, and plant-based meats and cows are bad, but it's really not about the specific animal. It's about how those animals are raised and how they're harvested. Everything eats. Everything eats. Even vegetables eat.
Right.
So sadly, all animals are adorable, but we're meant to eat animals at some point, and we're not going to ever stop people from eating animals. So the question then is, how do you raise animals in a way that is regenerative and organic? And most animals that we eat grass, and that's what they're meant to eat. They're not meant to eat corn and soy.
Right.
And that cycle of them eating and excreting is what creates a healthy ecosystem and what builds the soil. At the Farming Systems Trial, we study what we call green mulches, which are just like vegan farming, versus animal mulches. And the animal mulches always exceed in productivity. So if you're gonna eat meat, just make sure you know where it's coming from and how it's grown. And I think even a return to eating wild animals is a possibility. Venison, bison, kangaroo, these were all important food sources. So, thinking about ways that we can integrate those animals into our diet. Deer are local, and if they're raised in neighborhoods that don't use chemicals, then they're organic. But speaking of chemicals, the third point I want to make is that toxins travel. So what we've studied with the Farming Systems Trial is when you put chemicals in the soil, we have lysimeters, which measure the outcome. Those chemicals go into the water streams. That goes into the wells, it goes into the lakes and streams and in the ocean. And we're drinking it, we're swimming in it. It goes into the atmosphere and rains down. So anybody who's applying chemicals anywhere is not just applying it to their space, they're applying it everywhere, which is why finally I think community is essential, and realizing that we're all part of a community. We can't do this alone. We can't grow our own food alone. Nobody wants to grow all their food alone. And the act of how we grow food and how we eat food is a communal act, and the more we can keep it clean and organic and regenerative, the healthier we'll all be. And one last finding from the farming systems trial is that the healthier the organic system is, the more diversity there is in all of the soil life and all of even the plants that are growing there and the birds and the insects. So diversity is a key sign of health. And I think we have to apply that to our communities as well. So lastly, I just want to show a slide of the Rodale Institute contact information if you want more information about the farming systems trial. Our motto, our tagline has been healthy soil equals healthy food equals healthy people. And we often say healthy equals a healthy planet. And we're starting a certified regenerative organic label in partnership with the Regenerative Organic Alliance that includes animal welfare, social fairness, and soil health. So the most important thing you can do is just be regenerative organic, because regeneration is a natural process, as you said. It happens. Right. Nature wants to heal itself. Right. And when we get out of the way, it's not only possible to feed the world for now, but to feed the world forever.
Yeah. So what is the main project you're doing at Rodale Institute?
Well, the main project that we've been doing for the last 40 years, since 1981, is studying side-by-side organic versus conventional chemical agriculture. And the reason we started that was because people didn't think organic was viable, and there was no scientific data to show if it was or wasn't. So we said, well, let's find out. And over the 40 years, we've learned a tremendous amount.
Amazing. Now, Edwina, on the level of property and community, when we get to the level of the local, what's your advice to people when you think about this question of where do we go from here?
Well, I'm delighted to be here to sort of complete this conversation, because I think that what I call ornamental landscape, which is recreational, residential, it covers a lot of different landscape types, but it's non-extractive. So, and that's what I ask people to look at their land management practices from a different perspective, that we're not making money on this land in a way, that we're not taking something out. So if you do it right, you don't have to put anything back. I call it the food loop. I think it's really the food web, but food loop sounds more fun. So if you can keep all of your biomass on your property, which is an interesting challenge for homeowners, for parks, for anywhere, and process it in some way, that it's food that your place made for itself. And so when we're eating food, we're eating it, it's grown one place, we're eating it in another place, and we're pooping it in another place, and that is not a closed loop.
Right.
So we're needing to look at how to close the loops. And if we can't close the loop on our own property, we're going to have a serious problem closing the loop on the whole planet. So it's really as much a way of engaging people in what's happening on their property, and the other part is what you're growing. And why are you doing it? Because eventually the whole community will appreciate what you have done. And as Maria said, it's all about plants. Plants are the building blocks of biodiversity, of habitat. Habitat is food, shelter, and water. That's everything. That's what we need. And so if we aren't providing native plants for our wildlife, we are not providing habitat, because, and so Doug Tallamy has done some research which makes it quantifiable. So, because using birds as a key indicator species, which they do real well, the canary and the coal mine of biodiversity loss, he discovered that typically birds will need about 70% native plants in their range. So I just said, well, that's about 2/3. 2/3 rhymes with birds, so we do 2/3 for the birds. So if you can provide, which is kind of great, because that way people don't have to feel like I'm wrong, I don't have all native plant garden, I don't even know what that means, I don't know how to do it. Start with what you've got, and just make yourself a pledge. But this is what I'm asking of everyone in my profession, every professional landscape architect, every professional landscape designer, everyone who sits on an environmental board. I mean, this is a low bar. And if you don't plant 2 natives for every 3 that go in the ground in the future, and if you are using pesticides, then you're not really part of a solution.
Well, you know, landscape architects, I think a lot of people think of that field, landscape designers and architects, as maintaining the hedge, that kind of thing. But I wrote about Ian McHarg, who's like one of the grand pioneers of that thinking, and his insights spill into everything now. He was all about this layered approach to landscape. You start with the geology, the history, the hydrology, then the human footprint, and then think about where that community wants to go. But you only do that when you know the underlying issues, which is part of your work on what is missing also. Taking data and building conversations around it.
Well, it's also like, what is an artist going to do? Because I'm not trying to compete with what all the environmental groups are doing, what everyone's doing almost in the fields to do this. So how can an artist come in and maybe reshape what the problem is, or maybe sometimes do it with a sense of humor? We've got one that basically shows, like, you know, inspired by, you know, what's the largest crop grown in America? Question. Next slide, the American lawn.
Yeah.
And then the next slide after that says, did you know more gasoline is spilled refueling lawn equipment than was spilled at the Exxon Valdez?
Amazing.
Last slide, where we just do 50% of your lawn, give it back to nature. Now it's up to 2/3, which is fantastic. And then we list all the points from Perfect Earth about how to aerate, how to back yourself off of the toxins. And as we sit here and everyone is sitting on the lawn, it was a massive wake-up call when, like Edwina was pointing out, how toxic a normal industrial lawn is to your pets, to you, to your children. It's phenomenally toxic. I think there's something like 29 common pesticides and fertilizers that are known carcinogens. So again, it's really good for us, all of us, and the water and the air to get these poisons out of our systems. But it's also unbelievable moment in time where we have, you know, it's a critical path towards where we're heading with climate change, but we could be doing something that's good for our food systems, good for the planet, good for our own health and our own backyard, and also all of a sudden the soil is put to work. And I actually think we have no idea how complex the living soil network is. It is, as Maria said, like 1 cup of soil is like 1 billion microorganisms. 1 tablespoon.
Yeah.
And that is fixing the nitrogen, and it's fixing the soil, and it's fixing carbon back into the landscape. So I think we're at a critical juncture with climate change. It's almost like we're at the last possible minute. But the good news is it's the least expensive, least engineered, and it's right here. We've been doing it. You know, nature gave us photosynthesis. Nature gave us the solutions to this, and it will help feed us, as well as, I think one of my slides is like, we could absorb 50 to 90% of current climate emissions if we protect our forests, reform our agriculture and ranching practices. Again, wetlands become a huge, they call it blue carbon, and it's also, if we create increased marine protected areas, that's where we could basically feed more than 1 billion people. At which point, I always say there's an adage like, you know, when you're going bald, some people say you're losing hair, other people say, well, you're actually gaining face. So, as seas are rising, there's all this land that is going to flood. So what can you do? You can make that a buffer zone to protect us from rising seas. That wetland buffer zone now becomes an intense carbon fixer. I think those wetlands absorb 3 times as much carbon as a tropical forest canopy. So, I mean, these are the things that will just feed us, protect us, as well as bring back biodiversity. So it's vital. But I think all of us here know that it's a key critical time, but they have the keys to how to fix this.
So Bill, in your work, you're dug in on policy, and even among environmental groups right now, everyone seems so wedded to a certain track. We need all renewables by 2050, et cetera, that they end up in fights over the role of land or some other solution. What's the no-brainer aspect of this that you think needs to be conveyed better?
Well, I think there are two things. One is, I do think there is some more coalescing as of late around solutions. So I am hopeful, and I believe some of the trend is the urgency, the moment, the lost time, but also the opportunity. And right. the opportunity, while we are hearing a lot about the just falling cost of renewable energy, solar panels, wind turbine construction, a push for electric vehicles, nature is just here right now. It's so, the technology, we know it, it's ubiquitous, it can work in every ecosystem on the planet, and there are some, as Maya, certain systems like wetlands, they're more carbon absorptive. There's also the wetlands, which are, it's a dual role. On the one hand, there's the mitigation role of pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, photosynthesis, right. Releasing oxygen and storing that carbon, but also is the protective role that it plays. So, sure. The Nature Conservancy, we're doing big projects like locking up the carbon in huge forested landscapes. So we just closed on a deal in the Appalachians. It's 250,000 acres of forest, and the idea is to take that out of coal production as well. Right. So not only are you getting the carbon in the forest, but it's we're investing millions in retraining local economies and communities in sure. non-fossil fuel based, economy. But then the other side is the role nature plays in adaptation and resiliency. And that's one of the reasons I love the planting of the 1,000 trees to offset the emissions, because sure. Our city trees, they're absorbing carbon, as Maya said, but at the same time, what is coming, here we are in a pretty warm May afternoon, right. More heat waves, more intense right. heat waves. And what's the cheapest, simplest technology to address it? It's trees. Right. And it's about shading and dropping temperatures, right. Cleaning water after rainfall events, right. Improving property values in the neighborhoods where they go in. So nature has a really big role, and I just hope that doesn't get lost in all the EV renewable energy conversation, because it's right here, right now.
I agree. So we have a few more minutes, and I'd love to hear a little bit from each of you about the community thing too. And again, debates, farmers, among the farmers I've met are the most adaptable people on the planet, just about. They've been dealing with change throughout history of farming. And all we seem to hear in our social media landscape is big fights. But when you talk to farmers, what do you gets illuminated as a path forward that is not about debate?
Well, I think the thing that's been most heartening but also saddening is that a lot of times a farmer won't change and adapt until they have a personal crisis. They get cancer, or somebody in their family gets cancer, and they start to question everything they've been taught and told, and they call up the Rodale Institute and say, how can I change? And once they start to change, they see their whole lives transform. Yeah. But what's sad is that just because their lives transform and they're making more money and working less and healthier, their neighbors seem to still be stuck in that status quo of well, that's just not how it's done. And so there's attitude and emotional changes that really are important to happen. And I think that's where art really comes in. Because artists can create visions of what's possible. And I think when people can see, that's, when I was younger, my dad took us to see the Hunter Twasser exhibit. I don't know if have heard of Hunter Twasser, but he created these, beautiful communities with green roofs and all kinds of social systems around plants. And it was just very creative. And I know it inspired me to think about things differently. And there's no reason we can't have solar panel farms that are also grazing sheep underneath them.
For sure. Agro and sort of mixed cropping.
Yeah, so the creativity is what's really
but I also
needed.
think here's something that, and I hope we've played with some slides that just asks a question, what if we subsidize good practices rather
Right.
than bad?
That's huge.
Because I think the farming industry is victim in this country to industrialization. Corporations are running a lot of these very large agribusiness, and we subsidize them to do the absolute worst things for the environment.
Exactly.
When we know in the last 20 years, the growth market with the economy has been in organic farming practices. So this actually, we need to make policy experts aware, the administration, which is now very eager to do what they can to take a look at agriculture, especially because it is big business, and some would say it's intractable, but I think if we all make them aware, this is one of the biggest ways to reduce emissions.
I agree.
But we can't touch it without everyone sort of screaming, let's just subsidize good practices rather than bad.
And Andrew, what you were saying about, I think we as an environmental movement have spent, too much time fighting over what exactly we should and shouldn't eat, and, plastic versus paper, or, straws versus, and if we put all that energy into changing the subsidy system, it would be huge.
I mean,
we'd see instant change.
And our subsidies are actually paying to overfish the oceans, which is just horrendous. And as far as plants go, grasslands, I'm just in love with. We've lost in this country almost 98% of our grasslands, and in certain parts of the country, if you plant trees, it actually absorbs more heat, and you have to restore our grasslands. And then how do we, the capacity, if we reform our agriculture and ranching practices, can completely invite nature in to what is now a massive industrial no man's land, which is pretty toxic as well.
Right. Well, a last thought from you, Edwina, on this idea of conversation. I mean, to me, my big learning moment as a journalist came after spending 25 or so years writing about climate change in a one-way way. I write a story, you read the story, and the world changes, but of course it doesn't. It took me way too long to realize that conversation is as important as storytelling. And you are engaged with conversations with communities and individuals all the time. So if there's a last mantra you can offer to anyone who wants to get past some of the barriers, what would it be?
Well, I suppose it depends on, I think all the barriers that we're talking about entirely here is basically anxiety. Anxiety about change, perception, so it's social anxiety. What will the neighbors think? What will the farmer next door think? And will I fail at this? And so changing this privately owned land can make a very big difference. And it doesn't matter how small, because there is a bee somewhere looking for your window box if you have it planted with the right plant. And so don't be afraid, and let go, because we're over tidying our landscapes. The tidy thing is not habitat. That is the reverse of habitat. So your landscape should not look like your living room or your kitchen. There are ants, it's okay. Trees should be allowed to have some dead wood, in fact, a lot. Everything should be allowed to happen. And you can relax and start to see what's happening. And that to me is like, how about if you just like step back for a sec and let it happen?
That's a wonderful thought. And Maya, I want to give you the final word here and circle back to art, greening public art. There's so much exciting work. Ghost Forests is one piece. There seems to be a sort of a, I'm not calling it a renaissance, but a burst of public art that really is trying to capture this. So.
And I think it's exciting to see because, whether you go to like Mel Chin, who was using the soil with his plantings and his artwork to clean the heavy metals out of the soil. There's many artists doing that. Mary Miss working as they're cleaning up in the Bronx River. I mean, it's exciting what's going on. And I think just like, to me, everyone is doing great work. We need to see all of us, not in any silos at this moment, but let's look at the environmental community as a family, as a whole. Let's look at the best things that are being done. Let's scale it up. Everything we need to do to save ourselves, save our kids, save the planet, we're are in practice right now all around the world. So I think it's really just showing, because I think people are scared. People think there's nothing they can do that can make a difference. And I think what we're all saying is quite to the contrary. Go to your backyard, choose what you eat and how it's grown. We can make these choices, and then support groups that are planting and restoring forests, grasslands around the world. I mean, this is all part of it. You kind of have to get involved on a global level, choosing a couple groups as well as on a national level, and then take it down to your own personal experiences. And I think that's really, really important. For me, it's sort of like, I just ask, I mean, my goal was through What Is Missing. You can go to the website, whatismissing.org. It's in beta testing always. It's like this guerrilla art project. We only ask you to share a memory. Give us something that you or your grandparents, your parents personally witnessed diminish or recover, and then help out all these groups. Because my wish was to see all of us as one connected kind of movement. And that was sort of my belief system.
I think it's working. From the physical manifestation here to the online digital manifestation, you're doing great work. And it's great to be here today to help foster this kind of conversation. I think conversation too, again, spreading the word, making sure you're engaged, connect on these issues. Kids are doing this in wonderful ways too. So thanks to the Madison Square Park Conservancy and to Nature Conservancy, Rodale Institute, Perfect Earth Project, and Maya Lin for letting me be part of this conversation today.
Thank you for joining. Thank you for doing this with us. Thanks. Cool. Oh God, easy. I'm so honored we're all here together.
It's so refreshing just to think back to sitting on that lawn.
I know.
As opposed to being in these boxes again, but here we are. And here we are. Good. I'm Andy Revkin, and it's great to see that convening from last week. Was it just last week? I can't remember. Here together again with so many great people in the audience. And I'd love it if folks start to post their questions and comments. I thought I'd kick it off with a couple myself. Maya, I did want you to bring up what you're doing in this space, meaning the digital space, with What Is Missing, which draws on your history of memorialization, what you did with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and essentially creating an engagement place for people to not just learn, but to sort of offer their own reflections. A lot of what we were talking about just then on the law at the Ghost Forests exhibit was about what we can do with actual landscapes. But we're in a world where, close to 8 billion people can be connected with now through this system too. So great ideas can spread. And so what are you doing online?
Well, in a nutshell, it's part of a larger idea. What if I could make a memorial? It's the fifth and last of the memorial series, starting with Vietnam. Then there's civil rights, the Women's Table at Yale, Confluence Project, which involves the Native American tribes along the Columbia River Basin. I would say for 25, 30 years, as a child, I was very committed and interested and concerned about the environment. So I wanted to call in, my last memorial would be one that I would call into being. And so as that idea, it actually first exists as a permanent piece at the California Academy of Sciences, but the nexus for the entire project, and it's shown up at temporary exhibits around the world in various iterations. It's a volunteer project for me, so I tend to release a new iteration every Earth Day. And so the website, whatismissing.org, is a kind of a scary proposition as an artist, because within 2 years after I started the Listening Cone, which is the permanent piece at the California Academy, I popped in what would become the first part of What Is Missing online. So imagine making an artwork in full view and evolving it in full view, not quite knowing what it would become. oddly, I write, as an artist, I write about what I'm doing, and the framework has always been there. Could I make an ecological history of the planet, past, present, and future? And I started with what we are losing, the past. And so I created something called the Map of Memory. So that's where we invite anyone and everyone, share a memory with us. There's a phenomena that Jared Diamond calls landscape amnesia. I think Daniel Pauly said it's shifting baselines. With every successive generation, we only see what we see. So we don't realize that in the 1890s, the Atlantic cod was bigger than Bill, actually. It was huge. We know that a cod is about this big. And
It's amazing.
So this idea that how can we protect something if we don't even realize it's missing? I mean, for me, the wake-up call was the landscape. And I grew up in rural southeastern Ohio. The songbirds that I grew up with, they're in a 50 to 90% decline. So literally the soundscape, the sound landscape that I grew up with has completely shifted under our feet. So again, can I make you aware of what we're losing? But I made a promise to myself, and this was like 25 years ago, that I wouldn't just focus on loss, but I would believe that none of the memorials I've done have really just been about loss. These are teaching tools, but we have to accurately remember the past in order that the past can show us, maybe guide us to a different future. Unlike the other 4 memorials, this became an advocacy project for me. So the Map of the Present, we link to all the conservation and action, what's going on, best case practices around the world. And then I was waiting and waiting to figure out, well, what would the future be? And the future is part of something called Greenprint. Can we envision sustainable future scenarios? So that you'll notice on the Present website, again, always a guerrilla artwork, always a beta testing, will be the solutions will be kind of mapping the future, will show up in the fall of this year, but you can go on it now and there's hints of what mapping the future will be. So to me, I had no idea when I started it, what would it become, but I was shocked and really stunned that 50% of all emissions is caused by land use, degradation, and loss. It also is a main driver of climate change emissions and biodiversity loss. So for me, I launched a little video called Unchopping a Tree, which is all about, you can find it on the website. We can save 2 birds with 1 tree. I always say it's like 1 tree, 1 grassland, 1 wetland, 1 phytoplankton, actually. So that's sort of the beginning in a nutshell of what is missing is. You can go to it, please give us a memory, but also learn about what you can do to help. And it definitely, we're growing the links to all the groups because again, I kind of just wanted to work with as many groups as I could sort of post into it and say, go help this group out if you're interested in restoring fisheries, go help this group out. And it's just part of this ongoing, I call it my last memorial, but I'll be kind of volunteering to it for the rest of my life.
Yeah, I guess that gets at one other reality of this moment. We think of moments and tipping points and the like, but the journey we're on here in the Anthropocene, or whatever you want to call it, is a long one. It's the work of a lifetime. I had a co-professor at Pace University when I was teaching there, John Cronin, who taught a course in environmental policy that I love the design of, and maybe it's something you can all comment on briefly. Students for a semester would work on a project like, how can we help Tarrytown install solar panels over their train parking lot? But every semester's class had to write an exit memo for the next class, meaning it's implicitly understanding that this is a journey that takes time and generations. And what you just described has that aspect to it. I wanted to ask Bill briefly about the global scale. Right now, today is the day before World Environment Day. There's big online discussions around restoration, ecosystem restoration. There's sort of 2 paths forward. We discussed this a little bit on the lawn there. One is restoring stuff that's already degraded or brownfields, and what do you do with them? And the other is saving the last of what we consider as relatively pristine, even though we know a lot of that was already human shaped for thousands of years. So how do you divide that task in your own mind?
Well, the Nature Conservancy, certainly our history is the saving, and our tagline for a long time was saving the last great places. So it is these large intact forests, ocean systems. In the video we talked about creating new marine protected areas or large swaths of tropical forests or Appalachian forests. But I think the Nature Conservancy has been on its own learning journey, like everyone else, through all of this. And where it's taken us is, you don't reach these goals merely by conserving what's standing. There is a role in restoration and sort of rebuilding and renovating and regenerating. And it's been fun spending the time with Maria through all of this. Like, one of the big lessons for me, I'm a trained forester, so I have the big tree bias, but is the just hugely fundamental role that agricultural soils play in solving the climate challenge, the human health challenge, and the biodiversity crisis. And it's there. And I've been watching the chat and a lot of comments, and anything we do, we could do well or we could do poorly, and that's true of farming systems, that's true of livestock grazing, that's true of reforestation. And so whichever avenue we're taking, and I don't know, Andy, like, if I had a buck, is it 50-50, conserving the last great places, 50% restoration? Probably is overall, globally, something like that. But there is so much power in the regenerative, agricultural systems. So the Nature Conservancy is starting to work in all of that well. Like, it goes back to the video and the conversation we had in the park. We're a community. We have to work together. We have to bring our expertise and start landing in spaces that maybe weren't traditionally our strengths, but if we have some know-how and partners and ideas to bring to that, it's going to take all of us working together.
There are some great questions that have come in. One, let me just scroll back to it here. Someone named M. Feist asks the panelists, I would love a call for, and the word is all caps, less, L-E-S-S, less heating, less cooling, less driving, flying, consuming, wasting. So much we can do while also cleaning our infrastructure. If you agree, how can you see promoting this to a consumer society? So maybe that's a good one for Edwina to weigh in on first, because again, you deal directly with, I loved what you said in our chat about relaxing, meaning let the dead wood be part of the tree so the woodpeckers can enjoy it, et cetera. But this question of less is such a big part of what we're thinking about, and Maria too.
Yeah, it is. I think that people are back to that stress issue. People are feeling pressed to create landscapes in their that are under their own control, and control is the issue. They feel they have to control the nature outside their door, and I call this less, like do less. Actually, like the garden gateway drug, because once you begin to understand a natural system in your backyard, that leads you into not only a great world of wonder that you didn't have to do anything or buy anything, but you become a better citizen, you become a better caretaker for the earth. The earth doesn't really need your care, actually. Once again, it could do with less of us.
Get out of the way.
And so there was an old thing about, which goes back to what Bill was saying, like this balance between restoration and preservation. And there was when I first started getting involved in environmental work, and Bill might remember this from his work in Panama, something called the SLOSS, which was single large or several small. What should we save? One big piece or lots of little pieces? And in the end, it's both. And so I represent the several small, because if everyone could put the piece of land that they love, whether you own it or not, into a simple equation of 2/3 native and no pesticides, there's a huge amount of land we would be restoring or preserving. And we underestimate, I think, the power of the small pieces of land that once they aggregate and they start to connect, they then will connect to the bigger places. And we have and it have these huge pathways then for nature and to recreate biodiversity. And it really is about less. I mean, if we do nothing, the only thing that you kind of have to do is keep the invasives out. That's the one really active role we need to play in our own landscapes, is simply become educated about what an invasive plant is, what it looks like on your property. And some are more of a problem than others. So getting to know that, get to know your local garden club, talk to your cooperative extension, get to know the names of a few plants. Being in a garden where you don't know the names of anything, that's equivalent to going to a party and not knowing anyone there. You're going to feel left out and unhappy and a little bit afraid. So learn the names of a few plants in your yard, get to know them, just sit and watch them, do less, enjoy more.
I love that. I'm going to get to some of the questions from the session here again, but Maria, could you weigh in on the lessism? You know, how this is such an interesting question.
Yeah, as I was listening to Edwina, I was thinking about this one time I went to Memphis, Tennessee, and with a group, we were helping to transition some chemical farm researchers to organic methods. And we started with one field of that had been chemical for a long time and very degraded, and we planted buckwheat. And we were driving by with this man who'd been farming all his life, and he's like, look at it, it's growing all by itself. And that's the thing, nature grows all by itself.
Yeah.
We just have to kind of like understand and connect with nature in a way that works with it and assists it, rather than thinking, oh my God, I've got to do something, I've got to apply some chemical or some technology. It's very much an epic paradigm shift that we have to go through as a species, to understand that we're part of nature, and if we work with nature, we all succeed, and it's easier and more fun and more pleasurable. So it sounds simple, but it's not easy.
Yeah, and that also reminds me of the North American part of the Monarch Butterfly Challenge, which is when there were so many subsidies for growing corn, farmers were growing it right to the edges of their property.
Right.
And there's no room for the plants that the butterflies would benefit from. So if you're just...
Well, I wrote my first gardening book I wrote in 1997, and I classified milkweed as a noxious weed because that's what everybody was saying. And now my backyard is covered with milkweed, and it's, finally the monarchs have found their way there. But that's a classic example of we think we are helping and we're just hurting, and just, let nature do what it wants to do.
You've also just articulated a beautiful concept that's so important in a time of change, changing knowledge and changing landscapes, which is being open to new information. So that's pretty cool, acknowledging that we've all been on learning curves with our norms. Feather Phillips has posted some really interesting thoughts. She also is from Alligator, North Carolina, which I guess I want to go to. I've written about alligators quite a bit. She mentioned, Maya, that she lives in a ghost forest, sadly. But she has advice. Let's see, she asks, what advice do the panelists have for environmental artists who wish to create impactful public art in dynamic natural settings? Specific advice regarding the long-term costs of care and maintenance. In other words, how do you create something where the meaning endures, even where you're not ending up having to invest?
That's a good question. I mean, I'll take a little lead. Usually my permanent works, people ask, well, how long will they last for? And, I come from Southeastern Ohio, so the vestiges of the mound builders' work is all around you in Ohio, whether you go up to Mound City or just the Serpent Mound. And I think these pieces, you have to allow time. It's almost like you want and invite time in. These are living, growing pieces. I do a lot of my works in earth and grass. When I started the first one, University of Michigan, it was 100 feet by 100 feet. And I wasn't even thinking, this was almost 30 years ago, about toxicity. And now it's like the last projects, and I'm going back in, and everything's organic, non-toxic, low watering. Once you set it up, it should be naturally watering. And so there's been an arc in my work as an artist to really begin to understand. And it was a pleasure. I worked with Edwina on a few of my projects, and at Storm King we had Daryl Morrison, this brilliant grass expert, who came in, and he had planted a mix of seeds. Some would be there to hold the soil at the start. They would then become they would phase out, and other ones that had been planted would come in, and we're always watching it. I think we're always going up. We try to mow it as minimal, a few times a year. You have to whack it down. If it rains a lot, you might have to go in there a little bit more, because people do want to walk all over it. And so there is that. But I think the idea that we're trying to be as natural in our practices rather than the golf course mentality, which I think Edwina could go on and on with. But I think time is a friend, or should be a friend, to your work. This is a little bit like what Edwina talks about with your own backyard. Laziness, let things kind of evolve and grow, and nature is incredibly resilient. And if you give it a chance, it comes back. But also these pieces you want, it's like, you can make artwork that is made out of steel or whatever, and it will be there a certain way. But to me, the living works that I love, they decay, they change, they soften, and that's very much a part of the piece.
Fantastic. Well, we are going to transition, I think, out of this conversation, which has been wonderful. Anybody out there who's listening, I'm easy to get a hold of, just on Twitter @RevKen, or just Google for me and you can find me, and I can forward questions, and we could follow up by other means after this show. But I'm going to turn things back over to Brooke and the gang. It's been an honor to be part of this discussion, and it's a journey. So let's keep this conversation going long after this Zoom is closed. Over to
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Truth. Over to Truth.
Thank you, Maya Lynn, Maria Rodell, Edwina Van Gaal, and Andrew Revkin for this powerful assessment of nature-based solutions to climate change. We are now excited to welcome wonderful artists Dear Climate with Una Chowdhury and Marina Zerkow, Nicholas Galanin, and Tavares Strotkin to present on how their work addresses the environment and the land. Their bios can be found in the chat. Dear Climate will present first, followed by Nicholas Galanin, and then Tavares Strotkin.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. Hi, everyone. My name is Una Chowdhury. I'll start our presentation on Dear Climate, and then Marina Zerko, my collaborator, will take over in a few minutes. And on behalf of both of us, I want to thank Brooke and the Madison Square Park Conservancy for the opportunity to be part of this extraordinary event. And it's been so inspiring listening to the speakers so far. So Dear Climate began about 7 years ago as an effort to explore and expand the climate imagination that was prevailing at that time. So to a large extent, we were really interested in imagination, ideology, values, desires, interests. We wanted to bring the whole, this huge overwhelming issue into some kind of personal relationship to the individual. And in part, we were responding to certain trends that we saw and that we were alarmed by. And then, of course, we were inspired by other work that was just beginning around that time. So in terms of the former slide, next slide. So this would be an example. This was a poster that was all around New York at the time. Next slide. It's by Milton Glaser, a brilliant graphic designer. But it felt to us like this was firstly representative of what was the dominant tone at the time, which was one of fear, guilt, and almost a kind of hopelessness or paralysis because of the overwhelming nature of it. Next slide. Here's another kind of image that was common at the time. And there's a lot I could say about that image on the left, which with the human hand holding the globe. The one thing we felt about it is that there's a tremendous disconnect here between what we experience as individuals in relationship to this topic and the enormity of the challenge. On the left, on the right, sorry, you have an example of a kind of response to that image. And this is from Dear Climate, one of our posters. As you can see, the effort is to make this personal and to look for modes of intimacy. Among the art projects that really inspired us, next slide, was Annie Sprinkle and Beth Stevens' Here Come the Ecosexuals, which, next slide, there's this wonderful thing of just simply playing with an alternative metaphor. Instead of Earth as mother, they want to think about Earth as lover. And this very, very much inspired us to think in terms of just alternative possibilities in terms of our relationship to the more than human world. What Annie and Beth have done is a long project in which they've gone around the world marrying each other as well as elements of the planet. Next. We've got a couple of slides here. There's the one where they married the ocean and another where they married the forest. The metaphor that we became very interested in was the metaphor of friendship. Next. And we thought about our project as these three movements of mind: meet climate change, befriend climate change, become climate change. And again, it was about establishing intimacy, kinship. We, for example, asked that instead of cowering before these scary things, like we would just welcome them, recognize how powerful they are and acknowledge that. Next. Salute the superstorms, say hello to the hurricanes. Also, try to get into a more playful, more joking relationship with this enormous topic. Next. Also, what if we were to expand our circles of sociality and culture to include the more than human world? And we imagine ourselves relating to the pigeons as if they were performers, and the squirrels, which of course any of you who have a backyard know that they are. But then beyond that, we also want to experiment with other human behaviors, promiscuity, or flirtation, or even some of our less, desirable but very common attitudes like narcissism. So this kind of is our point of departure. And Marina's now going to talk about some of the ways we've been developing this. Thanks.
Thanks, Tina. So yeah, I'll talk more about the context for the work. We have a website, dearclimate.net. There's over 75 posters that are really intended to be these quick hits of an encounter with the climate in perhaps unexpected ways. In addition, we have 7 audio meditations that are a kind of unsettling form of listening and experiencing guided meditation. We've done several installations. This was one of the first at MU in Eindhoven, where you were in a container, a shipping container, surrounded by these posters and invited to write a letter to the climate, thus the title Dear Climate. We did a faux FEMA trailer, a solar powered trailer in, sorry, my computer's gone berserk, in Rice University in Texas. which was called the Office of Inner Climate Change, where you could seek out help. It was an unpersoned self-help trailer with all kinds of tools to listen to these meditations or get brochures that might help you meet, befriend, and become the climate. Let's just see. So then in 2019, we were fortunate to be part of the Storm King show Indicators, and we created a play off of the General Assembly from the United Nations Circle of Flags. This was situated at the main trolley stop on the property, and you would drive around and sort of be encircled by these messages and celebratory invitations. And then more recently, we shifted gears and created a set of 13 signposts. They're three-way trail markers. They're on the campus of Appalachian State in North Carolina. And you could think of these as a kind of walking curriculum. They're all sited in these little pocket parks around the campus, and various forms of invitations were distributed through class contexts, and people were able to interact with the signs as much as possible, given that it was COVID for most of the time that this has been up. Somebody earlier had asked about materials. All of the wood for the project was sourced through a sustainability initiative associated with the campus. It's red oak that's harvested modestly using draft horses. And the purpose of that is not to be quaint, but to really do minimal disturbance on the land, granted at the exertion of these animals, but nonetheless, it was a fairly sustainable approach. And the boards are all done with fast-growing black locust, which is also local. So these signs, Una, feel free to chime in. They range from scientific research to important books that we thought were really important to include in this discourse by people like Eduardo Cohn, who wrote How Forests Think, or Donna Haraway, The Idea of Stay with the Trouble, and then a lot of plays on what's actually around you in the space. So every signpost was determined in relation to what is inside the buildings, what's happening on the walkways, what's happening in the plantings around you. And I'll conclude on this poster, Power to the Porous. I think Una had a couple of things. I think we have 55 seconds left. So.
Yeah, thanks, Marina. Well, I guess I just want to say one of the things that we've experienced in the course of all our work, which is now a long period, 7 years of work, is something Maya mentioned, which is real broadening of interest in both the artwork and the academic world and beyond, certainly, in this subject, and also in this paradigm shift that Maria mentioned. When we started Dear Climate, we said we're not going for a paradigm shift. We're going for a series of conceptual nudges, because we just playfully want we want to invite people to imagine more enjoyable, creative, effective, lasting relationships with the more than human world. And now, that is a kind of dominant paradigm, certainly within academia. It's beautifully captured in the title of a recent book that I've taught many times, called The Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet. And I think that is the goal that Dear Climate is dedicated to. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Nicholas Galanin Yehiatzin. I'm here with you today from Sitka, Alaska. I want to just share a few brief images about where I come from. This is home. I think speaking about place is so important to particularly my understanding of the world and practice in general. I exist in my ancestral homelands. We've lived here, the Tlingit community, since time immemorial, so 15,000 plus years of documented connection and understanding and relationship to place. We follow the seasons. This is our calendar. It's not necessarily the calendars on the walls or the clocks. It's listening and understanding what these timelines are, and this is our survival. This is how we are able to exist still through continuum. In Tlingit culture, we have oral history that the bears taught us how to survive or to fish. And this photograph was taken, I believe, probably 2 years ago, but this is a seasonal fishing location where we're literally dip netting salmon with the bears. So this relationship is an abundance that we live closely with gives us deep understandings of seasons and places. Throughout history, colonization, commercial fisheries, climate crisis, we experience these changes on the front lines in our homes. And it impacts us. I live in an island that's, we harvest a lot of our meat and don't really purchase things at the grocery store as far as meat goes, I suppose. So this relationship to place is ongoing and continual. This is a totem pole raised in Juneau, Douglas for the Yanyedi. It's a healing pole. I was listening to Maya Lynn's talk earlier, just the conversation about softening and return over time. And one aspect about our totem poles is, they're created in continuum. The totems will eventually return back to the earth, obviously through colonization, settler colonialism. A lot of our objects and had been removed forcefully from land and placed into institutions, into museums, into these spaces. But it's a reminder that the continuum lives within us. So these stories that are held, even though the object might return, it's what's passed on. This pole was raised in 2018. In the 60s, Tlingit village was intentionally burnt down to remove the community and make way for a boat harbor. This erasure and removal is still ongoing. Settler colonialism is still ongoing and impacting our communities. These stories are oftentimes not spoken about or shared. Many people in the community didn't even know that this took place in that time. I want to fast forward to 2020. This was a time where the pandemic hit us. In this image taken in Seattle at the time, time of Black Lives Matters and anti-police brutality protests sweeping the globe. This particular image struck me, and the ongoing continual impact and battle and effort that we're up against. And this is Rick Williams. In 2010, his brother was extrajudicially murdered by Officer Ian Burke of the Seattle Police Department while crossing the road with his wood carving knife and his totem pole in hand. John T. Williams. So the decades-old conversations are still continuing, and this violence, settler colonial violence, is not only linked to the land and to our bodies, but also linked to the environment. Shadow on the Land, an excavation and bush burial. In 2020 Biennale of Sydney Niran, I created this installation for the Biennale. I was brought out there prior, maybe a year or so before, to do some research and meet with communities. During my visit, and if you've ever been out to any Indigenous community, there's a lot of similarities that we still face in narratives of history and violence of removal, and the continual struggle and battle for access to subsistence or access to clean water, and even land. Shadow on the Land, an excavation and bush burial, is an excavation of the Captain Cook statue and monument, which is located in Hyde Park in Sydney. The statue has a discovery plinth on it. This narrative, this false narrative of discovery, actively and erases Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous understanding, Indigenous histories to place. So for this work, I excavated the shadow of that statue, James Cook. The intention of this excavation is to dig deep enough to bury the monument, to bury the statue, and while doing so, using archaeology, which is oftentimes a scientific practice that upholds white supremacist narratives, placing Indigenous communities and cultures in the past. During this excavation, you would clearly uncover all artifacts of an existing community with deep understanding and relationship to place. During this excavation too, the intentions of the work were to sample soils. There's hundreds of sites on Indigenous lands that are polluted by resource extraction. This is one of the scenes that is common and familiar during this time, where these protests were taking place. The statues and monuments in question, conversations were who they represent and what they uphold, and this was not just unique to these locations. These are conversations that take place in the US, in Canada, and many different places, of whose narratives are upheld, whose violent legacies are ignored, and at whose expense. Current installation right now that I've got up, Never Forget. This is installed for the Desert X Biennial up until mid-August now on Agua Caliente Coahuila land. Never Forget this work is to scale of the Hollywood Land sign. Hollywood Land was initially, it's an icon now representing an institution, but it was initially a advertisement, real estate advertisement for settler white only communities to purchase land, stolen indigenous land. This work references that history. This work references the complex and varying histories across the United States and Canada, the Americas, of the process of colonization, removing indigenous communities while placing private land ownership and false boundaries across lands. This is the work is not actually the image or the sign here. The work is called to action. We live in an era where land acknowledgement is becoming popular by institutions, though no action is ever followed through with that. This work is a call for settler landowners to return land title back to indigenous communities. It recognizes that roughly 3% of land title, legal title, is owned by indigenous communities today. This work also acknowledges that in order for us to care for place and land, we must acknowledge the deep connection and understanding that indigenous communities have demonstrated since time immemorial in many of these places, caring and being part of land. Again, the work is the action. If you can't if you don't own or have legal title to land, you can still participate in this process via GoFundMe. I've set up a GoFundMe inviting anyone to participate through donating monetary. The actual piece is that action. The proceeds go to the Native American Land Conservancy to hopefully acquire legal sacred land, title to sacred lands for returning it back to indigenous care. This work also acknowledges that the land back movement is not necessarily a push to remove people from land. It's a push to care for land and to return to re-indigenizing that understanding of caring for place. Current project I'm working on right now in this continuum is a 23-foot canoe. This is red cedar. These canoes have provided for our communities in many ways. They've carried us safely to other communities. They sustained us through the access of abundance on the land and water here. And the process of this right now is probably about an 8-month project. We're carving Western red cedar. Red cedar is becoming more and more difficult to access in our communities, especially the old growth red cedar. I feel like we'll have this steamed and ready to go by July. So I don't know how much more time I have. I don't want to go over my limit here, so. I'll leave some time for questions if we do that, or we can keep moving. Thank you.
Nicholas, thank you so much for describing your work and a call to participation. Hello, Tavares.
Hi.
Hi. I have the pleasure, Tavares, of asking some questions of you to conclude our program. These are some slides of your past work. the distance between what we have and what we want. And you have brought a deep study of science, the planet, and exploration into your work. And you've personally trained and traveled to explore and to investigate. Through these explorations, you focus on women and Black and brown trailblazers whose searches and studies were groundbreaking, like Matthew Henson, the Black explorer of the North Pole, or Mary Bonin, a woman master diver in the US Navy. Can you speak to this, Tavares? Is there an individual or an audience you're trying to reach, you want to reach by incorporating individual narratives?
Yeah, I think that the approach that I've always been excited by is the approach of storytelling. I think we're all storytellers to some extent. And so I like to process all of the things that I'm working through the lens of storytelling, and how society decides what's important and what's not, and what society and human beings tend to focus on at a given time and in a given place. And those things somehow become culture. And I'm fascinated by, the kind of stakes of studying human beings and human existence and telling stories, especially ones that have been erased from a dialogue.
Can we share the slide with Matthew Henson? Which is the next slide. Yep, there we go. Tavares, do you want to just describe this work and this exploration?
So one of the things that I was always intrigued by is the natural world. And I was always hit by when technology collides with the natural world. In this particular work, it's shot at the North Pole, and it's a reenactment of Henson's arrival to the pole. And for those of us who might not know, in 1909, Robert Peary is claimed to discover the North Pole. And he was accompanied by a guy named Matthew Henson, who's in the photograph. And Henson more or less became a discredited element of the narrative. In addition to the indigenous folks who were there prior to both Henson and Peary. And so I was interested in reenacting this arrival to the pole as a way to think about the inherent violence of exploration, and the kind of paradigm that exists within the realm of exploration, and kind of human desire and human thriving, and a kind of lack of willingness to acknowledge those dichotomies of wanting and searching and claiming, and how those acts are profoundly and insanely violent. It's just like how erasure is violent, or omission is violent, right?
If we could go back to the, one more back. Thank you. It's now been 15 years since you traveled to the Alaskan Arctic and you extracted this 2.5 ton piece of ice from a frozen river there. The work dates to 2005. It's called the Arctic Ice Project. The ice and a freezer holding it were shipped to the Bahamas, where you were born and raised, and seen there by school children who were mesmerized by the frozen boulder. And then the work traveled to the Brooklyn Museum in 2009. share with us, please, the meaning of this piece, and were you summoning how people and natural resources and individual lives are exploited?
Yeah, I mean, I think moving landscape around, for me, talks about the fragility of human life, human existence, but it also talks about, again, some of these kind of problematic pieces of exploration. It talks about ownership and the absurdity of it. It also talks about putting nature on life support. And I think we're approaching that reality. And so this work was a way of considering, again, these very direct issues that I think humanity is confronting at this current moment.
Tavares, you're the closer of the symposium. You're the concluding voice of our last several hours talking about the earth, the land, citizens, and climate change, and of the art proclaiming the fragile state of nature. What message will you leave us with?
I think that we're all afraid in this moment of something. And I think one of the more profound things that I've heard from the late Bill Withers is his definition of courage. And courage is the thing that you do in spite of fear, right? So it's not about the avoidance of fear. It's about acting in the face of it. And as we think about these challenges creatively, and as we are naturally afraid of these things, I think it's important for us to think about being courageous.
I think that's a brilliant conclusion and a brilliant message to leave everyone with. Thank you for that. I want to thank everyone for attending this morning's program, and thank you to all of the thoughtful and searching speakers who have warned us and inspired us through their art and their activism and their work. We are so grateful for your participation and for leading us to the potential of individual impact. Stay well, everyone, and thank you.